Out of Order Gun Rights Podcast, Episode 70.
Welcome to the Out of Order Podcast, your window into the firearms community, exploring those shaping the future of our rights and protecting our lifestyle, laws, legal cases, activism, and self-defense in a candid and honest podcast for our brothers and sisters in arms. Here's your host, James Kalita.
Thanks for tuning in to episode 70 of the Out of Order Gun Rights Podcast. Today's sponsor is sellmorefirearms.com. Sellmorefirearms.com is a tool for FFLs and gun stores to use social media to increase sales. So if you go to sellmorefirearms.com, enter your email address, you'll get the free guide on using Facebook to sell more firearms. Today's guest is Blair Hagen. Blair is the Executive Vice President of the National Firearms Association of Canada. We talk about gun laws in Canada, the origins of Canada's gun rights. We do a little compare and contrast of America versus Canada and really dispel a lot of myths, because I tell you, I've talked to a lot of folks from Canada and I get a lot of different answers about what gun laws are really like, what they can have, what they can't have, what they aren't allowed to do. So now, here's Blair.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. Blair, you're the Executive Vice President of the National Firearms Association of Canada. Would you tell us a little about that?
National Firearms Association, this organization has been active in Canada since the late 1970s, was enacted out of a combination of a lot of groups that were reacting to the introduction of federal legislation at that time. It was decided to combine those organizations and have one national organization. So we've been around the block a few times.
Okay, great. And I hear a lot, depending on who I ask as I'm, traveling around, about what it's like to be a gun owner in Canada. But could you kind of tell us what it's like, what you can own, what you can't, what restrictions there are? I mean, some
Sure.
Canadians I talk to say, "Oh, we don't have guns here," and
Yeah, I hear that a lot too. I mean, a lot of people just buy into the government propaganda that guns are not a Canadian thing, and it's unfortunate. No, Canada is probably one of the most heavily armed countries in the world, certainly according to the United Nations. We've got a strong firearms culture here, strong history of firearms tradition and use. That sort of thing. Yes, you can own a handgun in Canada. It is restricted. Currently, it's restricted through a mandatory firearms license that a lot of people don't understand the nature of. What we have in Canada today is a mandatory license for the simple ownership or possession of a firearm. And that means whether you own it, you're going to lend somebody a firearm, that individual has to have a firearms license. Previous to the imposition of this back in 1998, something called an FAC, a Firearms Acquisition Certificate, was required for purchase. It was not required for ownership. It was basically a criminal background check. You received this from your local law enforcement agency, and you could buy a gun. That all changed in 1995 when the government of the day introduced comprehensive legislation that not only mandated the universal registration of all firearms. Previous to that, only handguns and machine guns and certain semi-automatic rifles were registered. It mandated the registration of every firearm in Canada, rifles and shotguns included. That was ended in 2012. It was frankly an international controversy, a worldwide controversy, the failure of the Canadian Firearms Registry. It was thankfully ended, but unfortunately we're still suffering the effects and ramifications of that Firearms Act, the parts of the Firearms Act that were not repealed at that time. So, what's it like to be a Canadian firearms owner? I guess it's sort of like being an American firearms owner in a lot of cases, except for the mandatory nature of the license. I understand some states don't mandate any type of license or permit for the ownership of firearm, and others do. So what a lot of Canadians are under the mistaken impression that there are no gun laws in the United States. The Second Amendment rules supreme, and the gun rights of Americans are guaranteed through the Constitution. And as we know, that's certainly not the case in reality.
Sure. So you mentioned the removing of the the long gun registration. And, I've been curious how you managed to do that. I grew up in New Jersey, and we have a lot of laws that a lot of people have tried to get taken away, and you guys succeeded where we haven't. How did you manage that?
Well, combination of things. Firstly, the legislation itself, it was a national controversy that we never saw in this country. When you said gun control to people, they either said, yeah, let's go for it, or, well, let's try it, and if it doesn't work, at least we tried. So I think there was sort of a nascent support for things like, the old firearms acquisition certificate or the registration of handguns, that sort of thing. Well, if it saves one life, is it not worth the inconvenience? But with that particular legislation and the imposing of mandatory licensing and universal registration, that completely changed the nature of the issue in Canada forever. Okay, guns became a national controversy for the first time. Unfortunately, at that time, there was no effective opposition in Ottawa. The opposition parties had basically collapsed. The government of the day had a massive majority and could basically bring in whatever legislation they wanted, and they did. It was a national controversy, but I think what happened was the legislation itself was poorly conceived and badly implemented. For such comprehensive legislation, which, every owner of a firearm in Canada had to get a license. Every owner in Canada had to register the gun. They just were not prepared to do that. Okay, they introduced several computer systems that failed. A lot of people who attempted to comply with the law could not comply with the law, and in some cases suffered criminal penalties for that. That undermined confidence in that program. The whole nature of registering rifles and shotguns. Yeah, a lot of owners of rifles and shotguns may have tacitly approved of the registration of handguns and other firearms, but hey, when it came to my rifle or shotgun, everybody basically knew as soon as it's registered, it's gone, because the government will come at some point in time and take it away from you. How can they? They know that you own it. They know where it is, and they can run an agenda based on that. So that really shook things up as well. I think what happened was, in a lot of cases, we got lucky where countries like the UK and Australia really did not. All right. So yeah, I put it down to the failure of the legislation, poorly conceived, badly implemented, national controversy created by it, and the fact that it consistently utterly failed. And that was exposed in 2002 when the Auditor General of Canada discovered that the entire program was 500% over budget.
Wow.
That basically undermined all political credibility of the legislation. And at that point in time, we worked towards a political solution to it. And that occurred in 2006 with the election of a conservative government. Could not change legislation, had a minority in public, and we worked towards a majority government. That was achieved in 2011. A year later, 2012, the registry was gone. Or so we thought, because it lives on in certain ways. As you may know or may not know, province of Quebec is conducting its own registry, and the registry data, which was supposed to be destroyed, according to the legislation, was not. It was secured by the RCMP and is now in the process of being transferred to the province of Quebec for the construction of its own provincial registry. So, the controversy, this stuff never ends. The controversy continues.
Yeah, and so as I understand, when you guys had the separation of the three different types of firearms, that many people were able to keep their semi-automatic rifles, their what we would erroneously call assault weapons here. Yeah. So did you, now that it's been 20 years, so are you seeing, how's that affecting the next generation? Is that generation angry that they can't participate with these firearms, or are they just sort of left out of the conversation?
No, absolutely. At the end of the day, this is a property rights issue, okay? And just because you still have it, because what they did was when they banned certain firearms, they introduced grandfathering process. So, yeah, if you licensed yourself and you got a registration for that firearm, you could keep it as long as you kept a valid firearms license and your registration info up to date. If you did not, they'd come and you were basically committing a crime and they would confiscate it from you. If you did that, if you jumped through those hoops, you got to keep it. But you could not, in a lot of cases, you could not pass it down to your heirs. okay? And if you sold it, you lost your grandfathering forever. So basically, it's affected people's right to own property, to enjoy the legitimate use and economic potential of that property, because it's very nice to own these things, but I mean, if it's basically worthless, that compromises a very big part of your estate. Okay. So basically, you've undermined the value of my property, my ability to lawfully own or dispose of it or sell it. And is it a big deal? Yeah, I would say it is, because people, I think, in Canada today, when it comes to the firearms issue, definitely look at it in terms of property rights. If I am not allowed to legally own my property, never mind that I may still have it locked up in my safe. But why are you doing this to me? Why are you affecting that? So, yeah, the grandfathering, I don't think it, although it was intended not to create a national controversy, because, in the UK and Australia, they had gun ban schemes and everybody had to turn them in. And that created national controversies that they did not want to see in Canada. So the Canadian way has always been, well, we'll ban the gun, but we'll grandfather the owner. He doesn't lose it, and eventually we get it anyways when he's dead and it becomes part of the state. We confiscate it from the widow, because there's only a gradually decreasing pool of people who can take possession of it. So they're not fooling anybody with that anymore.
And so over here we have, what some of our attorneys call victims of gun control, where you have someone that's trying to comply with the law. They're law-abiding folks, and yet somehow they accidentally either violate a law or they're accused of breaking a law that they didn't break and end up in court. Do you have scenarios like that up there in Canada?
Oh, absolutely. Same thing in Canada, and it's due to the very nature of the firearms license. And you see this a lot in domestic situations. Yeah, the police will get a call, there's a domestic situation, and the first thing they do is do a check of the registry and find out if there's a firearms license registered to that address. Now, basically, there's a firearms license connected to that address. They know there's a gun there, and they go in accordingly. And yeah, it is SOP, regardless of that situation, to seize the firearm, whether it's warranted or not. It's a domestic situation. It's quieted down. Everybody's kissed and made up. The gun is still going, okay? And if in the follow-up investigation there is no grounds to continue to hold the gun, yeah, you may get it back. You may have to get a lawyer to do that. But again, it's the licensing is used to create firearms disabilities for individuals. We have the same thing with people who attempt to purchase firearms. If we have something called an FIP connected to the firearms license, Firearms Interest Police. So if any incident involving yourself, there is some question as to your suitability to purchase a firearm or own a firearm. That's connected to your file. It has to be reinvestigated before you can get your gun back or a new purchase is allowed. And it's a highly bureaucratic system. And in a lot of cases, it doesn't take much to get that type of flag attached to your file. So all of these things are problematic, and they may be brought in with the best intentions. Nobody supports domestic violence, and everybody wants to stop violence altogether. But the devils are in the details, and when you have the rights and property of law-abiding individuals targeted in such an unwarranted way, I think it creates opposition to and resistance to the system that's imposed to create that.
And here in the States, we go back to the Second Amendment, and there isn't too much talked about its origins or where it came from. But in Canada, although you don't have it written into your Constitution, there is some historical basis for you guys having a right to bear arms for self-defense. Oh,
absolutely. I mean, our rights are derived from the same place Americans' right to keep and bear arms is derived from. We have the original right. The Founding Fathers of the United States wrote that into their Constitution. Moment of brilliance. A lot of Americans think, well, the Second Amendment gives me the right to keep and bear arms. It does not. The Second Amendment recognizes a pre-existing right, okay, and it codifies it in the American Constitution. So that was a brilliant step for Americans to be blessed with. That was not thought necessary in Canada. Our rights are derived from British common law. British common law is widely recognized and will always be observed. Well, here we are, hundreds of years later, and it is not. And we have basically Canadian governments holding the rights and property of Canadians in contempt. And, that's a political situation that we've been trying to deal with for 20, 34 years. So, absolutely, Americans should support their Second Amendment rights.
And how is self-defense and the use of a firearm viewed and treated in Canada? I mean, can you carry a firearm for self-defense if someone comes into your home? There's, here we have the law and then how you're actually treated in court. How is it up there for you guys?
That is exactly the same thing in Canada. There is a carry permit and authorization to carry available if you want to carry a firearm for your own defense. However, the criteria for issuing that are so tight that it basically is never issued. Okay. The policies in terms of issuing that permit basically make it unavailable for 99.9% of Canadians. And it's only that very, very small percentage of politically connected or wealthy Canadians who can attain that. The permit itself is issued for a very limited time span, and it's subject to all kinds of conditions by provincial chief arms officers. So, yeah, even though it does exist, for the average Canadian, no, it's just not attainable. Self-defense, that's a very interesting thing. We've had several incidents in Canada you may have heard of where individuals have been forced to use self-defense firearms in self-defense, and it has been recognized as legitimate by the courts. And it's been a long, hot summer, especially on the prairies, and there's been a lot of hot home invasions in rural areas and that sort of thing, where firearms were unfortunately had to be deployed. And in many cases, the individuals were exonerated of the charge of manslaughter for having used that. The act was found to be legitimate. So yes, you can use a firearm for self-defense in Canada, but unfortunately, the criteria that's employed by crowns and courts is very, very narrow. What they seek to do is create a level playing field between the criminal and the victim. So if the criminal has a gun, well, then, yeah, it may be reasonable for you to use a gun to defend yourself. If the criminal does not, then, well, no, that may not be reasonable for you to do that. Was it reasonable under the circumstances for you to take that gun out of storage and load it to defend yourself? It really depends case by case, and unfortunately, there's no what you may call castle law where, somebody comes onto your property, you assume they have ill intent, and you are empowered by law to deal with it in any manner you need to. That doesn't necessarily exist, but I think with recent court precedents, it has proved that the right to use a firearm to defend yourself has not been extinguished in Canada.
And so for Americans that want to travel up there to go hunting, because I hear you guys have some excellent hunting up there, what do they need to know? What should they not do it? Is it not worth the risk? Or
no. Thousands of Americans travel over the border every year for that purpose. If you're bringing a firearm with you, you do have to declare it at the border, and you receive a temporary license for that. Okay, and that's for what we might call non-restricted rifles and shotguns. Hunting firearms, that sort of thing. There is no unrestricted importation of handguns. If you're bringing a handgun to Canada, it has to be for a legitimate purpose, and that is usually a shooting competition. And Americans do this, okay? So you declare that at the border, you receive a temporary registration, and you attend the event, and then you leave at the appointed time. But the gun is legal in Canada for the duration of that. So it's not impossible to bring a gun to Canada as long as you jump through the hoops. And it's the same thing for Canadians traveling to the United States. A lot of Canadians travel to the USA for hunting or to attend shooting competitions, and even with handguns. And there's a process that has to be done with the ATF to do that. So it does happen.
Yeah, and I always ask my guests if there are any books they recommend that every gun owner should read, whether that politically or about firearms. Any come to mind?
Books, I think mine is probably Joyce Lee Malcolm, Anglo-American Right to Keep and Bear Arms. I mean, you need to understand where your rights come from, okay? Because they're always saying, and I know this is the case in the gun debate in the USA, they're always questioned. Well, the Second Amendment does not confer an individual right to keep and bear arms. I mean, it's nonsense. But if you recognize that it's nonsense, you need to know why it's nonsense, because there's a lot of misinformed people out there who want to redefine the nature of this issue, and you need to be educated.
And where can people find you? Best way to find National Firearms Association.
Best way to find us is online, www.nfa.ca.
And what should people do to help? How can we help with gun rights movement in Canada?
How can Americans help the gun right movements in Canada? Boy, that's a tough one. It's funny because the gun debate in Canada is always predicated on what's going on in the United States, and a lot of the reasons for that are not really recognized by Canadian politicians and media. It's like, well, I mean, we're bringing in these gun laws because we don't want to happen here what happens in the United States, and they don't understand some of the reasons why some of those egregious things happen in the United States and have happened in Canada as well, and have been used to justify onerous and punitive legislation. What can Canadians do? Keep coming. What can Americans do for us? Keep coming to Canada. Okay, keep hunting here, keep shooting here. Take part in what we have to offer. We have a common heritage here, and we need to enjoy it.
Hey, well, all right. Thank you so much for being on the show. Any parting words for our audience?
Parting words? Keep doing what you're doing. I mean, the United States of America, people who believe in freedom, are that guiding light for the rest of us. And we've suffered some pretty horrendous legislation. Just ask the Brits and the Aussies. But that common history, those common values, that right to keep and bear arms is an Anglo-American right, and we all enjoy it. So keep on doing what you're doing.
All right. Bye. Thank you very much for being on the show, and look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thanks for tuning in to episode 70 of the Out of Order Gun Rights Podcast. Wanted to let you guys know about a gun giveaway from SOBMMC. That's Sons of Blackwater Military Motorcycles Club. One of their members was injured in an accident, and they're holding a gun raffle, $10 for a chance to win a Model 110 Lightweight Storm or an M&P Shield 45. So I just want to ask you guys, I'll put links to that on the show notes page, and if you go to the show notes page, outoforderjameskalita.com/70, we'll put links to Blair's organization, nfa.ca, the books that he mentioned, and to the Sons of Blackwater Military Motorcycle Club. I also want to invite you guys to consider reviewing the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher. Really helps the rankings, really helps me get to that 1 million mark. Happy to say we broke 10,000 the other day. So if you have a chance, outoforderjameskalita.com/70, and of course you'll find links there to iTunes, Stitchers, and all your favorite podcatchers. Out of Order, James Kalita. We'll see you next time.